You never think your own child will look you in the eye at your husband's funeral and tell you that you're about to lose everything. But there I was, 6 to 7 years old, standing beside my husband of 42 years casket, when my son Trevor whispered those exact words into my ear. Before we dive into this story, let me ask you something. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you could happen to any mother, in any city, in any state. And if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted more than your own heartbeat, you'll understand why I had to do what I did. Hit that subscribe button, because this story gets darker than you can possibly imagine. My name is Ruth, and 48 hours ago, I buried the love of my life. Harold Pemberton wasn't just my husband, he was my business partner, my best friend, and the father of our 3 children. We built everything together. Started with a small construction company in Tucson back in 1981, just Harold with his pickup truck and me keeping the books on our kitchen table. By the time he died, Pemberton Construction was worth $40 million. $40 million. I still can't wrap my head around that number. But standing there at Riverside Memorial Cemetery, watching them lower Harold's mahogany casket into the ground, all I could think about was the way Trevor had smiled when he said those words. Not the sad smile of a grieving son. The cold, calculating smile of someone who'd been planning something for a very long time. Trevor was 38, our middle child, and he'd been working alongside his father for 15 years. He knew every contract, every business deal, every investor. Harold had always said Trevor had the sharpest mind for business of all our kids. Sarah, our oldest at 41, was a pediatric nurse in Denver. She had Harold's gentle heart but no interest in construction. And Marcus, our baby at 35, was an artist living in Portland, creating sculptures that nobody understood but everyone pretended to love. Trevor was supposed to be Harold's successor, the chosen one, the son who would carry on the Pemberton legacy. So when he leaned over during the final prayer and whispered, "I hope you enjoyed the good life while it lasted, Mom, because you won't be getting a dime from Dad's will," my blood turned to ice water. I stared at him, searching his face for some sign that grief had made him cruel, that he didn't mean what he'd just said. But Trevor's brown eyes, Harold's eyes, were steady and cold. He adjusted his black tie and turned his attention back to the pastor as if he'd just commented on the weather. The rest of the funeral passed in a blur. People came up to me with their condolences, their casseroles, their promises to call. Harold's business partners shook my hand and told me what a good man he was, how sorry they were for my loss. His brother Frank flew in from Chicago with his wife, both of them crying harder than I was. Even Harold's first girlfriend from high school showed up, now a gray-haired woman with kind eyes who told me she'd always admired how happy Harold looked whenever she saw us around town. But through it all, Trevor's words echoed in my head. "You won't be getting a dime." How was that possible? Harold and I had been married for 42 years. We'd built that company together. I'd worked 60-hour weeks right alongside him, managing payroll, dealing with suppliers, keeping track of contracts. In Arizona, we had community property laws. Even if Harold had wanted to leave me out of his will, which made no sense, I'd still be entitled to half of everything we'd built together. Wouldn't I? That evening, after all the guests had gone home and the leftover funeral food was packed away in my refrigerator, I sat in Harold's study surrounded by 40 years of memories. His desk was still messy the way he liked it, with construction blueprints scattered across the surface and his coffee mug sitting exactly where he'd left it 3 weeks ago, before the heart attack that took him from me in less than 4 minutes. I picked up that coffee mug, blue ceramic with "World's Best Dad" printed on the side, a Father's Day gift from Sarah when she was 12, and held it against my chest. It still smelled like him. Like coffee and sawdust and the cologne I'd bought him every Christmas. That's when I noticed Trevor's car was still in my driveway. He came into the study without knocking, carrying 2 glasses of Harold's good bourbon. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking more like the little boy I'd raised than the cold stranger who'd threatened me at his father's funeral. "Mom," he said, handing me one of the glasses. "We need to talk." I set the bourbon on Harold's desk without drinking it. "About what you said at the cemetery." Trevor settled into Harold's leather chair, the one Harold had bought to celebrate our first $1 million contract, and took a long sip of his drink. "I didn't want to upset you during the service, but you need to know what's coming. What's coming is the reading of your father's will next Tuesday. And whatever's in that will, we'll deal with it as a family." Trevor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "See, that's where you're wrong, Mom. Dad left everything to me. The company, the properties, the investments, even this house. Everything. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That's impossible. Is it? Trevor leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Think about it. Who's been running the day-to-day operations for the last 5 years while Dad's health was declining? Who secured the Morrison Mall contract? Who negotiated the deal with Sunset Development? Who built the relationships with the City Planning Commission? You did, I admitted. But that doesn't mean. It means Dad knew who was really keeping this company profitable. And it wasn't his wife who spent the last decade playing bridge with her friends and volunteering at the library. The words hit me like a physical blow. Playing bridge? Volunteering at the library? As if 40 years of building a business together meant nothing. As if raising his children, managing his household, and supporting his dreams were just hobbies I'd picked up to pass the time. Your father would never. My father was a businessman, Mom. And good businessmen don't let emotion cloud their judgment. Trevor finished his bourbon and set the glass down with a sharp click. He knew you couldn't run Pemberton Construction. He knew Sarah and Marcus have no interest in it. So he left it to the person who could actually keep his legacy alive. I stared at my son, this man I'd carried in my body for 9 months, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged and whose fears I'd soothed and whose dreams I'd supported every single day of his life. And I realized I didn't recognize him at all. Even if that were true, I said slowly, community property laws in Arizona mean I'm entitled to half of everything we built during our marriage. Trevor smiled that cold smile again. That's where you're wrong. Dad was very careful about how he structured things. Very, very careful. He stood up and straightened his tie, transforming back into the stranger who'd ambushed me at the funeral. The will reading is Tuesday at 10. Mr. Richardson's office. I'd suggest you prepare yourself. After he left, I sat in that study until 3 in the morning, going through every file cabinet, every drawer, every box of documents Harold had kept. Looking for what, I wasn't sure. Some evidence that Trevor was lying. Some proof that the man I'd loved for 42 years hadn't betrayed me in the worst possible way. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I was starting to realize something terrible. Harold had been acting strange for the past year. Secretive. He'd started having meetings I wasn't invited to, phone calls he'd taken private. When I'd ask about them, he'd just say it was boring business stuff that wouldn't interest me. He'd always included me in everything before. And Trevor had been encouraging that distance. I remembered now how he'd started saying things like, "Don't worry about bothering Mom with the contract details, Dad. She's got enough on her plate." Or Mom doesn't need to sit through another zoning meeting. Let her enjoy her book club. They'd been pushing me out. Slowly, carefully, systematically pushing me to the margins of the company I'd helped build. And I'd been so grateful to have more time for myself, so happy to see Harold and Trevor working together, that I'd never questioned it. I'd never seen it coming. As the sun started to rise over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky the colors of fire and regret, I made myself a promise. If Trevor thought he could steal 40 years of my life and leave me with nothing, he was about to learn exactly who he was dealing with. His mother hadn't spent 4 decades building a $40 million empire by being weak. And she sure as hell wasn't going to roll over and die now. 5 days until the will reading, and I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except the growing certainty that my life as I knew it was about to end. But instead of wallowing, I decided to do what Harold had taught me when we were first starting out. Gather information before making any decisions. If you've ever had someone you trusted completely betray you, you know that horrible feeling in your stomach when all the pieces start fitting together. When you realize that every strange conversation, every odd look, every seemingly innocent comment was actually part of a larger plan. That's exactly what was happening to me, and it was making me sick. I started with Harold's office at Pemberton Construction. I still had my key. After all, I was technically still part owner, regardless of what Trevor thought. I drove there early Monday morning, before any of the crew would arrive, and let myself into the building that Harold and I had designed together back in 1995 when the company was finally successful enough to move out of our garage. Walking through those empty hallways felt like visiting a museum of my own life. There was the wall where we'd hung our first big contract, framed and signed by the mayor. The conference room where we'd celebrated every milestone, every promotion, every new hire. Harold's office, with the family photos on his desk and the painting Sarah had made in high school hanging behind his chair. But when I sat down at his computer and started going through his files, I found something that made my blood run cold. A folder labeled estate planning, confidential, that I'd never seen before. Inside were dozens of documents, all dated within the last 18 months. Legal papers with words I didn't understand, contracts with language so technical it might as well have been written in a foreign language. But one thing was crystal clear. Trevor's name was on everything. Harold had been systematically transferring ownership of company assets to Trevor, bit by bit, over the course of almost 2 years. Not selling them, gifting them. Equipment, contracts, even the building I was sitting in. All of it moving from Harold Pemberton to Trevor Pemberton, with notarized signatures and official filing dates. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through document after document. How had I not known? How had I not seen bank statements or tax forms or legal notices? But then I remembered. Harold had switched us to a new accountant about 2 years ago. Said the old firm was getting too expensive and this new guy, some hotshot who specialized in construction companies, would save us money. I bet Trevor had recommended him. I printed everything. Every document, every transfer, every piece of evidence that my husband and son had been planning my financial destruction for almost 2 years. The printer ran for 20 minutes straight, and by the time it finished, I had a stack of papers 3 inches thick. Just as I was gathering everything up, I heard footsteps in the hallway. "Mom." Trevor's voice. I quickly shoved the papers into my purse and turned around just as he appeared in the doorway. He was wearing his work clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt with the Pemberton Construction logo embroidered on the chest. The same logo I'd designed in 1987. "What are you doing here?" he asked, but his tone wasn't surprised. It was suspicious. "Going through your father's things," I said, standing up from Harold's chair. "Trying to understand how the business is structured. I figured I should know these things before Tuesday." Trevor stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. "Mom, we've talked about this. The will reading is going to be hard enough without you getting your hopes up." "My hopes up?" I kept my voice calm, even though my heart was racing. "Trevor, I helped build this company from nothing. I have a legal right to know how it's organized. You have a legal right to whatever Dad left you in his will, which we'll all find out about on Tuesday." He walked over to Harold's desk and started straightening papers, clearly checking to see what I'd been looking at. "Until then, maybe it's better if you stay away from the office. Let the crew focus on work instead of having to deal with emotions." Emotions. As if my 40 years of sweat and sacrifice were just feelings that might inconvenience his employees. "Of course," I said sweetly. "I wouldn't want to be a distraction." But as I drove home, my mind was spinning. Trevor was scared. I could see it in the way he'd checked Harold's desk, in the way he'd rushed to get me out of the office. He was afraid I'd find something that would expose their plan. Which meant there was something to find. That afternoon, I called Harold's brother Frank in Chicago. Frank was a lawyer, not the kind who handled wills and estates, but he understood legal documents better than I did. More importantly, he'd loved Harold like a brother and had no reason to lie to me. "Ruth," he said when he heard my voice, "how are you holding up? I've been worried sick about you since the funeral. I need to ask you something, Frank, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did Harold ever talk to you about his will? About his plans for the company?" There was a long pause. Too long. "Frank." "Ruth." He sighed deeply. "Harold did call me a few months ago. He was asking about estate planning, about the best ways to transfer business assets to avoid taxes." My stomach dropped. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to talk to a specialist, someone who understood Arizona law better than I do. But Ruth," he seemed troubled. Like he was wrestling with a difficult decision. "Did he mention leaving me out of his will?" Another pause. He asked hypothetical questions about spousal rights in Arizona, whether there were ways to limit them. I closed my eyes and leaned back against my kitchen counter. Even Frank, Harold's own brother, had known something was happening. "Why didn't you call me?" "I should have," Frank said quietly. "I should have, but Harold made me promise not to say anything. He said he was just exploring options, that it probably wouldn't come to anything. Ruth, I'm so sorry." After I hung up, I sat in my empty house and tried to understand how I'd become so invisible in my own life. How had my husband and son managed to plan my destruction right under my nose? How had I missed all the signs? But then I remembered something Harold used to say when we were first starting out: information is power, Ruthie. The person with the best information always wins. I might have been blindsided, but I wasn't beaten. Not yet. That evening, I drove to Sarah's old friend Lisa Chen's house. Lisa was a forensic accountant now, working for law firms around Phoenix. We'd stayed in touch over the years, mostly through Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, but I knew she was someone I could trust. Lisa invited me in for coffee and listened without interruption as I told her everything. About Trevor's threats, about the documents I'd found, about Frank's confession. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Ruth," she finally said, "what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated asset protection scheme. If it's done correctly, it can be very difficult to challenge, even for a spouse. But not impossible." Lisa smiled, the first genuinely hopeful expression I'd seen in days. "Nothing's impossible. But we'd need to prove that Harold wasn't mentally competent when he signed the transfers, or that Trevor exercised undue influence, or that there was fraud involved." "How do we do that?" "We follow the money. Every transaction, every document, every signature. If there's something fishy about this whole thing, the paper trail will show it." She leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "But Ruth, this kind of investigation takes time. And if Trevor is as smart as you say he is, he's probably covered his tracks pretty well. The will reading is Tuesday morning. Then we'd better get started." Lisa spent the next 3 hours going through the documents I'd printed, making notes and asking questions I couldn't answer. Questions about dates and signatures and business transactions I'd never heard of. By the time she finished, it was past midnight. "There are definitely some red flags here," she said, organizing the papers into neat piles. "Transfers that happened very quickly, all within a short time frame. Almost like someone was in a hurry to get them done before Harold died." "Before he changed his mind, you mean?" "Maybe. Or before someone found out what was happening." Lisa looked at me carefully. "Ruth, I have to ask this. Is there any chance Harold was having an affair? That there might be another woman involved in this?" The question hit me like a slap. No. Absolutely not. Harold wasn't that kind of man. But even as I said it, doubt crept into my voice. Because if Harold could lie about his will, if he could plot to leave me penniless after 42 years of marriage, what else might he have lied about? Lisa must have seen something in my expression, because she reached across the table and took my hand. "We're going to figure this out, Ruth. Whatever's really going on here, we're going to uncover it." I drove home through the empty streets of Tucson, past the neighborhoods Harold and I had helped build, past the schools where our children had played, past the life we'd created together. And I realized that win or lose, nothing would ever be the same. The man I'd loved for 42 years had betrayed me. My son had looked me in the eye and threatened me. And in 4 days, I was going to have to sit in a lawyer's office and listen to them destroy everything I'd worked for. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me. The night before the will reading, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the king-sized bed I'd shared with Harold for 23 years, staring at the ceiling and listening to the desert wind rattle our windows. Harold's side of the bed was cold and empty, his pillow still holding the slight indentation of his head. I kept replaying every conversation, every strange moment from the past 2 years, looking for clues I'd missed. Like the time last Christmas when Trevor had made that odd toast at dinner. He'd raised his glass and said, "Here's to Dad, who's finally learned to put family first." At the time, I'd thought it was sweet. Now I wondered if it was a coded message about their secret plans. Or the way Harold had started handling all our financial paperwork himself, telling me I didn't need to worry about boring business stuff anymore. He'd switched our mail to a P.O. box, saying it was more secure for company documents. Had that been to hide the legal papers from me? Every memory felt poisoned now. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went to Harold's study. I'd been avoiding it since the funeral, but tonight I needed to be surrounded by him one more time before I lost everything that reminded me of our life together. I settled into his chair and opened the bottom drawer of his desk, where he'd always kept his personal papers. Birth certificates, passports, old love letters I'd written him when we were dating. At the very bottom was a manila envelope I'd never seen before, marked Ruth, personal in Harold's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 3 weeks before his death. "My dearest Ruth," it began, and I could practically hear his voice reading the words. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. and I imagine you're confused and hurt by what's happening with my will. I wish I could explain everything in person, but my heart is giving me warnings that I may not have much time left. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper steady. I want you to know that everything I did because I love you. Because I wanted to protect you from something you should never have to deal with. Trevor isn't the man we raised him to be, Ruth. He hasn't been for a long time. I had to stop reading and catch my breath. Harold had known. Whatever was happening, Harold had known about it. About 18 months ago, I discovered that Trevor had been stealing from the company. Not little amounts. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. He'd been setting up fake vendor accounts, approving invoices for work that was never done, skimming money from contracts. He was very clever about it, very careful. But I've been in this business too long not to notice when numbers don't add up. The letter went on to describe Harold's investigation into Trevor's theft. How he'd hired a private forensic accountant without telling anyone, not even me. How the investigation had revealed that Trevor owed over $2 million to some very dangerous people in Las Vegas. Gambling debts that he'd been trying to pay off with company money. When I confronted Trevor, he broke down and confessed everything. But Ruth, what scared me wasn't the money he'd stolen, it was what he threatened to do if I exposed him. He said he'd make sure everyone knew that you had been involved, that you'd been helping him cover it up. He had forged documents with your signature, fake emails from your account, financial records that would make it look like you were a co-conspirator. I felt like I was going to be sick. I couldn't let him destroy you, Ruth. So I made a deal with him. I would restructure the company assets to pay off his debts and give him a fresh start, but only if he agreed to leave you completely out of it. Every transfer, every legal document, was designed to protect you from being implicated in his crimes. The letter explained Harold's real plan. He hadn't been cutting me out of his inheritance, he'd been setting up a complex legal structure that would make it look like Trevor was inheriting everything, while actually ensuring that I would be protected from any criminal charges and would eventually regain control of the company through a series of trust arrangements. The lawyer handling this, James Richardson, has detailed instructions about how this is all supposed to work. There's a second will, Ruth, one that Trevor doesn't know about. Mr. Richardson will explain everything after the first reading. But the most shocking part came at the end. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about this while I was alive. I was terrified that Trevor would carry through on his threats if he suspected I'd told you the truth. But more than that, I was ashamed. Ashamed that our son had become someone capable of such betrayal. Ashamed that I'd failed as a father. Ashamed that my heart was giving out before I could fix the mess he'd created. The letter was signed with Harold's usual scrawl, followed by a postscript that made me start crying all over again. P.S. The blue ceramic coffee mug in my study has a false bottom. I've been leaving you little notes there for 40 years. Check it one more time. With trembling hands, I picked up Harold's favorite coffee mug and examined it carefully. Sure enough, there was a tiny seam near the bottom that I'd never noticed. When I twisted it, the bottom section came off, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a tiny folded piece of paper with Harold's handwriting. You are the strongest woman I've ever known, and the love of my life. Whatever happens, don't let them break you. Give them hell, Ruthie. I sat in that study until dawn, holding Harold's letter and crying for everything we'd lost. For the son who'd become a stranger. For the trust that had been shattered. For the 42 years of marriage that had ended with secrets and lies and desperate protection schemes. But by the time the sun came up over the Sonoran Desert, I'd made my decision. I was going to that will reading, and I was going to let Trevor think he'd won. I was going to watch him celebrate my destruction, let him savor his moment of triumph. And then I was going to watch his world fall apart. Because Harold was right about one thing, I was stronger than anyone gave me credit for. And if Trevor thought he could threaten me, steal from me, and destroy everything Harold and I had built together, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. I spent the morning getting ready with more care than I'd taken since the funeral. I chose a simple black dress, nothing too fancy, nothing that would make Trevor suspicious. I wanted to look like the grieving widow he expected me to be. Vulnerable. Defeated. Ready to accept whatever crumbs he decided to throw my way. The performance of my life was about to begin. As I drove to Mr. Richardson's office, I thought about all the times Harold and I had driven this same route together. Going to sign contracts, to close deals, to celebrate milestones. We'd been partners in every sense of the word, and even though he'd kept this final secret from me, I understood why he'd done it. He'd been trying to save me one last time. Now it was my turn to save everything we'd built together. The law office was in a gleaming high-rise downtown, all glass and steel reaching toward the desert sky. I arrived 10 minutes early, just as Harold had taught me. Early is on time, Ruthie, and on time is late. Sarah was already there, having flown in from Denver the night before. She looked tired and sad, her nurse's uniform replaced by a simple navy dress. When she saw me, she jumped up and wrapped me in a fierce hug. "Mom, how are you holding up? You look exhausted." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just ready to get this over with." Marcus arrived a few minutes later, his long hair pulled back in a ponytail and wearing the only suit he owned, the same one he'd worn to his college graduation 15 years ago. He hugged me too, his embrace smelling like paint and sadness. "This is so surreal," he said quietly. "I keep expecting Dad to walk through that door and tell us this was all some elaborate practical joke." Trevor was the last to arrive, and when he walked into the waiting room, I could see the confidence radiating from him. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal gray one Harold had bought him for his promotion to vice president. His hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked like a man who was about to inherit $40 million. He nodded politely to Sarah and Marcus, then looked at me with what I now recognized as barely concealed contempt. "Mom, ready for this?" "As ready as anyone can be," I said softly, playing the role of the defeated wife perfectly. Trevor smiled that cold smile I was learning to hate. "Don't worry. I'm sure Dad made provision for you. A small nest egg, maybe enough to keep you comfortable." The condescension in his voice made me want to slap him, but I just nodded and looked down at my hands like the broken old woman he expected me to be. Mr. Richardson's secretary called us in, and as we walked toward the conference room where my life would supposedly be destroyed, I touched the letter in my purse one more time. Trevor thought he was about to get everything he'd schemed for. He had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side of that door. The conference room was exactly what you'd expect from a high-end law firm: mahogany table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Tucson. Mr. Richardson sat at the head of the table with Harold's will in front of him, looking every inch the expensive attorney in his tailored suit and gold-rimmed glasses. James Richardson had been Harold's lawyer for the past 15 years, handling everything from business contracts to our house purchase. He was a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of calm presence that probably charged $500 an hour. I'd always liked him, but today he seemed different somehow. More formal. Almost nervous. We took our seats around the polished table, Sarah and Marcus on one side, Trevor and me on the other. The irony wasn't lost on me that Trevor had positioned himself as far from me as possible while still making sure he could watch my reaction to every word. "Before we begin," Mr. Richardson said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to express my deepest condolences to all of you. Harold was not just a client but a friend, and his loss is felt by everyone who knew him." Trevor shifted impatiently in his chair. Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Marcus stared out the window at the desert mountains in the distance. And I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, playing the part of the grieving widow who had no idea what was about to hit her. "Now," Mr. Richardson continued, "the reading of a will is often difficult for families, as it forces us to confront the reality of our loss while dealing with practical matters. Harold's will is complex. There are several components, and I ask that you let me read through everything before asking questions." He opened the folder and pulled out a thick document bound in blue legal backing. The last will and testament of Harold James Pemberton, executed on March 15th of last year. 8 months ago. Just as Harold's letter had indicated, he'd been planning this for a long time. "I, Harold James Pemberton, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils." The formal language washed over me as Mr. Richardson read through the standard legal disclaimers and definitions. But I could feel Trevor's excitement building beside me. His leg was bouncing under the table, and he kept glancing at me with that smug smile, waiting for the moment when I'd realize I'd been left with nothing. "To my beloved wife Ruth," Mr. Richardson read, and I felt everyone in the room tense up. "I leave my personal effects, including my wedding ring, my watch collection, and all photographs and mementos of our life together." That was it. Personal effects. Trevor actually chuckled under his breath. To my daughter Sarah Elizabeth Pemberton Walsh, I leave the sum of $500,000, with the hope that she will use it to further her education or to provide security for her family. Sarah gasped and started crying. $500,000 was more money than she'd ever imagined having. To my son Marcus David Pemberton, I leave the sum of $500,000, with the understanding that this will allow him to pursue his artistic passions without financial worry. Marcus looked stunned. Both of my younger children had just been given enough money to change their lives completely. And to my son Trevor Michael Pemberton. Mr. Richardson's voice seemed to slow down, and I could practically feel Trevor holding his breath. I leave the remaining assets of my estate, including all interests in Pemberton Construction, all real estate holdings, all investment accounts, and all business assets, with the understanding that he will continue the family legacy with integrity and honor. Trevor let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He'd gotten everything. $39 million, give or take. The house, the company, the investments, everything Harold and I had built together over 4 decades. However, Mr. Richardson continued, and something in his tone made everyone look up sharply, these bequests are subject to certain conditions and considerations outlined in the following sections. Trevor's smile faltered slightly. What kind of conditions? Mr. Richardson held up a hand. If I may continue, Mr. Pemberton. Section 4 outlines the conditions under which these bequests take effect. He flipped several pages and found the section he was looking for. When he started reading again, his voice carried a different weight, as if he was delivering news that would change everything. The inheritance outlined above for Trevor Michael Pemberton is contingent upon the following conditions being met within 60 days of my death. First, that a complete forensic audit of Pemberton Construction's financial records for the past 5 years shows no evidence of theft, fraud, or misappropriation of funds. The color drained from Trevor's face so quickly I thought he might faint. Second, that Trevor Michael Pemberton has no outstanding debts exceeding $50,000 to any individual or organization, particularly those involved in gambling or other high-risk activities. Trevor was staring at Mr. Richardson with an expression of growing horror. Dad wouldn't have, he couldn't have known. Third, Mr. Richardson continued relentlessly, that Trevor Michael Pemberton submits to a psychological evaluation to determine his fitness to manage a business of this size and complexity, said evaluation to be conducted by a licensed professional chosen by the executor of this estate. Sarah and Marcus were looking back and forth between Trevor and the lawyer, clearly confused by what they were hearing. But I understood perfectly. Harold had set a trap, and Trevor was about to walk right into it. And fourth, Mr. Richardson said, his voice now carrying just a hint of satisfaction, that Trevor Michael Pemberton provides a complete accounting of all funds borrowed from Pemberton Construction over the past 5 years, including detailed explanations of how said funds were used. Trevor shot to his feet, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. This is insane. Dad can't put conditions like this on my inheritance. I'm his son. Mr. Richardson looked at Trevor over his glasses with the expression of a man who'd seen this reaction before. Actually, Mr. Pemberton, your father can put any conditions he chooses on his bequests, as long as they're not illegal or against public policy. These conditions appear to be entirely reasonable requests for transparency and accountability. But the debts, the audit, his asking for things that would take months to complete. Actually, Mr. Richardson said calmly, your father was quite specific about the timeline. 60 days should be more than sufficient for someone with nothing to hide. The silence in that room was deafening. Sarah and Marcus were staring at their brother like they'd never seen him before. Trevor was standing frozen beside his chair, his face a mask of panic and rage. And me? I was watching my son's world crumble with the same cold satisfaction he'd shown me at Harold's funeral. There's more, Mr. Richardson said, turning another page. Section 5 outlines what happens if these conditions are not met, or if Trevor Michael Pemberton chooses not to comply with them. Trevor sank back into his chair, all the confidence and arrogance drained out of him. In the event that Trevor Michael Pemberton fails to meet any of the conditions outlined in Section 4, or chooses not to submit to the required evaluations and audits, his inheritance shall be forfeit. In such case, all assets originally bequeathed to Trevor Michael Pemberton shall instead be distributed as follows: 50% to my beloved wife Ruth Ann Pemberton, and 25% each to Sarah Elizabeth Pemberton Walsh and Marcus David Pemberton. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Harold had done it. He'd found a way to protect me while giving Trevor one last chance to come clean and make things right. But Trevor wasn't interested in making things right. "This is blackmail," he snarled, his composure completely gone. "He's trying to blackmail me from beyond the grave." "Mr. Pemberton," Mr. Richardson said firmly, "your father has simply requested transparency. If you have nothing to hide, these conditions shouldn't present any difficulty." Trevor laughed, but it was the bitter sound of a man who'd just realized he'd been outmaneuvered by a dead man. "Nothing to hide. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows I can't pass those conditions." Sarah leaned forward, her face pale. "Trevor, what are you talking about? What's going on?" For a moment, I thought Trevor might confess everything right there. Tell his siblings about the stealing, the gambling, the threats he'd made against me. But instead, he turned to look at me with pure hatred in his eyes. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You knew about this. You helped him set this up." I met his stare calmly, no longer bothering to play the role of the defeated widow. "I didn't know anything until 3 days ago, when you told me at your father's funeral that I wouldn't be getting a dime. That's when I started asking questions." "Questions about what?" Marcus asked, looking more confused than ever. I pulled Harold's letter from my purse and set it on the table. About why my husband of 42 years would suddenly decide to leave me penniless. About why my son would threaten me at his father's funeral. About what kind of man I'd raised. Trevor's eyes fixed on the letter with the intensity of a predator spotting prey. "What is that?" "A letter your father left for me, explaining everything he couldn't tell me while he was alive." I unfolded the pages and held them up so everyone could see Harold's handwriting. "About the money you stole from the company. About the gambling debts. About the threats you made against me." Sarah gasped. Marcus went white. "And Trevor?" Trevor looked like a cornered animal. "That's not, he couldn't have." Trevor's voice was barely a whisper. $2 million, I said, reading from Harold's letter. "That's how much you stole from the company we built together. $2 million to pay off gambling debts to people in Las Vegas who break kneecaps when they don't get their money." "Mom," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face, "please tell me this isn't true." Trevor was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, I could see him calculating his options. Could he deny it? Could he claim Harold was lying? Could he somehow turn this around and make himself the victim? Finally, he spoke, and his voice was so cold it made me shiver. "Fine. Yes, I took money from the company. Yes, I had some gambling problems. But everything I did to save the business. Do you have any idea how competitive construction is these days? How many companies are going under because they can't adapt?" "So you adapted by stealing?" Marcus asked, his voice full of disgust. "I adapted by taking risks. By making investments that would pay off in the long run. And they would have, if Dad hadn't panicked and ruined everything." Mr. Richardson cleared his throat. "Mr. Pemberton, I should inform you that your father also left instructions regarding the forensic audit. It's already been initiated by the firm of Chen and Associates. Ms. Lisa Chen will be conducting a complete review of all company financial records going back 5 years." My heart jumped. Lisa Chen, my daughter's old friend who'd helped me understand the documents I'd found in Harold's office. Harold had planned this too, even down to who would conduct the audit. Trevor's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, rage, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. 60 days, he said slowly. 60 days, Mr. Richardson confirmed. "And if I don't comply? If I choose not to submit to this persecution? Then your inheritance is forfeit, and the assets are distributed as outlined in Section 5. Trevor looked around the table at his family, at Sarah's tear-streaked face, at Marcus's expression of betrayal, at me sitting calmly with Harold's letter in my hands. And I could see the moment when he realized that he'd lost everything. Not just the money. Not just the company. His family. His reputation. His future. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "Of course," Mr. Richardson replied. "You have 60 days from today's date to comply with the conditions. That gives you until..." He consulted his calendar. December 15th. As we gathered our things to leave, Trevor pulled me aside in the hallway. His grip on my arm was tight enough to leave bruises. "This isn't over," he whispered. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what I'm capable of." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face with an expression that must have surprised him, because he immediately let go. "Trevor," I said quietly, "I spent 40 years building a life with your father. 40 years of sweat and sacrifice and compromise. You think you can intimidate me with threats? You think I'm afraid of what you're capable of?" I stepped closer to him, close enough that only he could hear what I said next. "I know exactly what you're capable of. You're capable of stealing from your own family. You're capable of threatening your own mother. You're capable of destroying everything your father worked for." I paused, letting that sink in. "But what you're not capable of is outsmarting a woman who's been fighting battles since before you were born." Trevor's face flushed red with anger, but before he could respond, Sarah appeared beside us. "Trevor, we need to talk. All of us. As a family." He looked at his sister, then at Marcus who was standing behind her, then back at me. For just a moment, I saw a flash of the little boy he used to be, the child who'd cried when he scraped his knee and run to me for comfort. But that child was gone. The man standing in front of me was a stranger who'd chosen greed over family, lies over love. "There's nothing to talk about," he said. "I'll figure this out on my own." As he walked away, his footsteps echoing in the marble hallway, I realized something that should have made me sad but somehow felt like relief instead. I'd gotten my son back in the worst possible way. I'd learned exactly who he really was. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next morning, I met Lisa Chen at a small cafe near her office. She'd already started the forensic audit, and the preliminary findings were even worse than Harold's letter had indicated. "Ruth," she said, spreading financial documents across our corner table, "in 30 years of forensic accounting, I've rarely seen embezzlement this systematic and this sophisticated. Your son didn't just steal money, he created an entire shadow accounting system." Lisa showed me how Trevor had set up fake vendor accounts, complete with business licenses and tax ID numbers. Companies with names like Desert Landscape Solutions and Southwestern Equipment Rental that existed only on paper but had received hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments from Pemberton Construction. "The really clever part," Lisa explained, "is that he mixed legitimate expenses with fake ones. So when you or Harold reviewed the books, you'd see payments to real suppliers alongside payments to his fake companies. It would take a detailed audit to spot the discrepancies." "How long has this been going on?" "Based on what I've found so far, at least 3 years. Maybe longer." Lisa pulled out a timeline she'd created, showing the progression of Trevor's theft. It started small, a few thousand here and there. But over time, the amounts got larger and the fake transactions more frequent. I stared at the numbers, trying to wrap my head around the scope of my son's betrayal. $2 million. That's what Harold's letter said. Harold's number was conservative. I'm tracking closer to 3 million, and I'm not done yet. $3 million. Stolen from the company his father and I had built from nothing. Money that should have gone to employee bonuses, equipment upgrades, expansion plans. Instead, it had gone to Las Vegas casinos and whatever other debts Trevor had accumulated. "There's something else," Lisa said, lowering her voice. "I've been looking into those gambling debts Harold mentioned. I have contacts in Vegas who help me trace assets in divorce cases. Trevor owes money to some very serious people." "How serious?" "The kind of serious where people don't just threaten to break your legs, they actually do it. And if they can't get their money from you, they start looking at your family members." A chill ran down my spine. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "I'm saying Trevor's problems are bigger than just stolen money. The people he owes aren't going to care about will readings and forensic audits. They want their money, and they want it soon." That afternoon, I drove to Pemberton Construction for what I suspected might be the last time as an owner. I needed to see the place again, to understand what we were really fighting for. The company occupied a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Tucson, main office building, equipment yard, warehouse space for supplies and materials. Harold and I had designed it all ourselves in the late 1990s when business was booming and we thought we'd work there forever. I parked in what used to be my designated spot and walked through the yard, past the bulldozers and excavators and concrete mixers that represented millions of dollars in assets. Equipment that we'd purchased one piece at a time as the company grew, each new machine a symbol of our success. The employees who saw me nodded respectfully, but I could tell they'd heard rumors about Harold's will. About family problems. About the company's future being uncertain. These were good people, skilled workers who'd been with us for years, Office staff who'd become like extended family. They deserved better than to be caught in the middle of Trevor's mess. I found our foreman, Pete Sandoval, in the equipment barn doing maintenance on one of the excavators. Pete had been with us for almost 20 years, starting as a laborer and working his way up to running job sites. He was the kind of employee Harold and I had always valued, loyal, hardworking, honest. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said, looking up from the hydraulic system he was working on. "Good to see you. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing, Pete. How are things here? How's the crew doing?" Pete set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a shop rag. "Well, to be honest, everyone's pretty worried. There's been rumors about the company being sold, about layoffs, about Mr. Trevor making big changes." "What kind of changes?" "He's been talking to some contractors from Phoenix about subcontracting our work. Says it would be more efficient than keeping our own crews." Pete shook his head. "But Mrs. Pemberton, these Phoenix guys don't know our market, don't know our clients. And they sure don't care about quality the way we do." I felt sick. Trevor wasn't just stealing money, he was preparing to dismantle everything Harold and I had built. The relationships, the reputation, the loyalty of employees who'd helped make us successful. "Pete, can I ask you something? Off the record?" "Of course, Have you noticed any problems with equipment or supplies going missing? Any irregularities in work orders or invoicing?" Pete was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with something. Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Pemberton, I didn't want to say anything because Mr. Trevor is your son and all, but, yeah, there's been some strange things happening. Equipment signed out for jobs that don't exist. Invoices for materials that never showed up on site. When I asked about it, Mr. Trevor said it was just paperwork errors, that the office was reorganizing the system." "When did this start?" "Maybe 2 years ago. It wasn't obvious at first, but over time, you notice things. Like, we'd order concrete for a job, but the amount that showed up would be less than what we paid for. Or we'd rent equipment for a project, but the rental company would say we'd already returned it when I knew it was still on the job site." 2 years. Just like the timeline in Harold's letter and Lisa's audit. "Pete, I need you to do something for me. I need you to keep track of anything unusual you see. Write it down, take pictures if you can, but don't let Trevor know you're doing it. Can you do that?" Pete nodded grimly. "Mrs. Pemberton, I've got kids to feed and a mortgage to pay. But I've also got 18 years invested in this company, and I don't want to see it destroyed by someone who doesn't understand what it took to build it." That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Sarah and Marcus. We met at my house, in the same living room where we'd celebrated every Christmas and birthday for the past 20 years. But tonight felt different, like we were planning a war instead of planning a family dinner. "I need to show you both something," I said, pulling out the evidence Lisa had gathered. "Financial records, bank statements, timelines of Trevor's theft. This is what your brother has been doing to our family business." Sarah studied the documents with her nurse's attention to detail, while Marcus just looked confused by all the numbers and legal terms. But as I explained what each piece of evidence meant, I could see them both beginning to understand the scope of Trevor's betrayal. $3 million. Sarah whispered. "He stole $3 million. At least. And that's just what we've found so far." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so much like Harold's that it made my heart ache. "Mom, I don't understand. Why would he do this? He was Dad's successor. He was going to inherit everything anyway." "Because he couldn't wait," I said. "Because he had gambling debts that couldn't wait for Harold to die naturally. Because he thought he was smarter than his parents and could steal from us without getting caught." Sarah was crying again, but this time it was angry tears. All those times he acted so superior, so important. Acting like he was the responsible one while Marcus and I were just playing around with our careers. He was stealing from us. From our family. "What do we do?" Marcus asked. "Do we call the police? Have him arrested?" I'd been thinking about that same question all day. We could. But if Trevor goes to jail, the people he owes money to don't get paid. And that puts all of us at risk. I told them what Lisa had discovered about Trevor's Vegas debts, about the dangerous people who were expecting their money. Both of my children went pale. "So we're trapped," Sarah said. "We can't turn him in without putting ourselves in danger, but we can't let him get away with it either. There's a third option, I said. We let Harold's plan work. We let the 60-day deadline run out, and then we take control of the company ourselves. But what about Trevor's debts? What about the dangerous people? I smiled for the first time in days. That's where it gets interesting. Because Harold was even smarter than I realized. I pulled out another document Lisa had found, a life insurance policy on Harold that I'd never known existed. A policy that would pay out $5 million if Harold died of natural causes within 2 years of the policy being issued. Harold took out this policy 18 months ago, right around the time he discovered Trevor's theft. It's separate from his will, so it's not subject to any of the conditions or delays. The beneficiary is me, and the insurance company has already approved the claim. Sarah stared at the policy document. $5 million. Enough to pay off Trevor's debts and still have money left over to stabilize the company. Harold made sure I'd have the resources to clean up Trevor's mess without bankrupting the family business. For the first time since Harold's funeral, I felt like we had a chance. Not just to survive, but to win. To rebuild what Trevor had damaged and to create something even stronger. But first, we had to make it through the next 57 days. And I had a feeling Trevor wasn't going to go quietly. 3 weeks after the will reading, Trevor made his first desperate move. I was having coffee with Lisa Chen, going over the latest audit findings, when my phone rang. It was Pete Sandoval from the equipment yard. Mrs. Pemberton, you need to get down here right away. Mr. Trevor is loading equipment onto trailers, says he's moving it to a more secure location. But I don't think that's what's really happening. I drove to Pemberton Construction faster than I'd driven in 20 years, Lisa following in her car. When we arrived, we found Trevor supervising the loading of our most valuable equipment, 2 excavators, a bulldozer, and several smaller machines, onto flatbed trailers operated by a company I'd never seen before. Trevor. I called out as I got out of my car. What's going on here? He turned around, and I was shocked by how different he looked. He'd lost weight, his clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The confident man who'd threatened me at Harold's funeral was gone, replaced by someone who looked desperate and cornered. Mom, what are you doing here? Pete called me. He's concerned about equipment being moved without proper documentation. Trevor's laugh had a sharp edge to it. Pete's concerned? Pete doesn't make the decisions around here. I do. Not according to your father's will. Until you meet those conditions, you don't legally own anything. I gestured toward the equipment being loaded. This looks suspiciously like theft. It's asset protection, Trevor snapped. There are security issues you don't understand. Threats that require immediate action. Lisa stepped up beside me, her forensic accountant's mind clearly working. Mr. Pemberton, may I see the contracts with this moving company? And the insurance documentation for equipment in transit? Trevor's face flushed red. Who the hell are you? Lisa Chen, the forensic accountant conducting the audit specified in your father's will. And I'm curious about why you're moving expensive equipment without proper documentation during an active financial investigation. I could see Trevor calculating his options. He could order us to leave. It was technically still his workplace. He could have the equipment loaded anyway and deal with the legal consequences later. Or he could try to bluff his way through. He chose to bluff. These machines are being moved to a secure facility while we restructure our operations. It's a temporary measure. Where? Lisa asked simply. What? Where are they being moved to? What's the address of this secure facility? Trevor opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. Behind him, one of the truck drivers was getting impatient. Look, buddy, we've got a schedule to keep. Are we loading this stuff or not? That's when I knew for certain what was happening. Trevor wasn't moving the equipment to a secure facility. He was selling it. Probably to pay off at least part of his gambling debts, hoping to buy himself more time. Stop, I said loudly enough for everyone in the yard to hear. Do not load any more equipment. The truck driver looked confused. Lady, I got a signed contract here. Let me see that contract, Lisa said, walking over to him. Trevor moved to intercept her, but Pete Sandoval suddenly appeared with 2 other employees, all of them looking grim and determined. Mr. Trevor, Pete said quietly, maybe we should all slow down and make sure we're doing this right. Your dad always said to measure twice and cut once. It was a gentle way of saying they weren't going to let Trevor steal equipment on their watch. These men had worked for Harold for years, and they understood what was really happening. Lisa examined the contract the truck driver handed her, her expression growing darker by the second. "This is a sales contract," she announced. "Not a moving contract. Mr. Pemberton, you're selling company equipment worth approximately $800,000 to Desert Salvage and Equipment for $200,000 cash." The numbers hit me like a physical blow. Trevor was selling equipment worth nearly $1 million for a quarter of its value. Fire sale prices that suggested desperation, not business strategy. "You have no right to examine private business documents," Trevor said, but his voice was weak. "Actually," Lisa replied, "as the court-appointed auditor for this estate, I have every right to examine any transaction involving company assets. And this transaction violates several provisions of your father's will." Trevor looked around at the faces surrounding him, his mother, the forensic accountant, his father's loyal employees, even the truck drivers who were starting to realize they'd walked into a family dispute. For a moment, I thought he might break down and confess everything. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone. He pulled out his cell phone and made a call. "It's me," he said. "We have a problem. The old lady is here with some accountant, and they're blocking the sale." "No, I can't just." "Yes, I understand what happens if I don't deliver, but..." He listened for a moment, his face going pale. "Okay. Yes. I'll handle it." When he hung up, Trevor looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not desperation, but something close to hatred. "Mom, you need to understand something. The people I owe money to don't care about wills or audits or 60-day deadlines. They care about getting paid. And if I don't pay them, they're going to start collecting from other members of the family." A chill ran down my spine. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm warning you. These aren't the kind of people who send strongly worded letters when they don't get their money. They're the kind of people who show up at your house at 3 in the morning. Pete stepped closer to Trevor, his weathered face hard. "Mr. Trevor, I think you better be very careful about what you say next." But Trevor was past caring about consequences. The phone call had clearly delivered some kind of ultimatum, and now he was trapped between his creditors and his family. "You want to know the truth?" he said, his voice rising. "Fine. I owe $4 million to people in Las Vegas who will kill me if I don't pay them. Not hurt me, kill me. Dad's little 60-day game doesn't change that reality." Sarah and Marcus weren't there to hear this confession, but Lisa was recording everything on her phone, and Pete and the other employees were witnesses to Trevor's admission. $4 million. I said. Harold's letter said $2 million. Trevor laughed bitterly. Harold's information was 6 months old. Interest rates with these people are steep. I felt a mixture of fear and sad resignation. My son was admitting to owing money to killers, and his solution was to steal equipment from the family business and sell it at fire sale prices. "Trevor," I said quietly, "there's still time to fix this. You can still comply with your father's will. Submit to the audit, get help for your gambling addiction, work with us to rebuild what you've damaged." "With what money?" he snapped. "Even if I inherit everything, it's not liquid. It's tied up in equipment and property and contracts. These people don't accept IOUs backed by construction equipment." That's when I realized something important. Trevor didn't know about Harold's life insurance policy. He didn't know that I had access to $5 million in cash that could solve his immediate problem. And I wasn't going to tell him. Because Harold's plan was working exactly as he'd intended. Trevor was being forced to reveal the full scope of his betrayal, to admit what he'd done and what he owed. Every day that passed, every desperate action he took, was building a stronger legal case for his disinheritance. "Load the equipment back up," I told the truck drivers. "This sale is cancelled." "Lady, we got a contract." "The contract is void," Lisa said firmly. "Mr. Pemberton doesn't have legal authority to sell company assets while the estate is under audit." Trevor started to argue, but his phone rang again. He looked at the caller ID and his face went white. "I have to take this," he said, walking away from the group. We couldn't hear the conversation, but we could see Trevor's body language. He was pleading, explaining, promising. And from the way his shoulders slumped, it wasn't going well. When he came back, he looked defeated. 30 days, he said. They're giving me 30 more days to come up with the money. After that. He shrugged. Well, let's just say it won't matter what Dad's will says because I won't be around to inherit anything. Pete cleared his throat. Mr. Trevor, maybe it's time to call the FBI. People who threaten to kill you over money, that's federal crimes. Racketeering, extortion. Trevor shook his head. You don't understand. I borrowed the money willingly. I signed contracts. In their world, this is just debt collection. As the truck drivers unloaded the equipment and left without payment, I found myself feeling sorry for Trevor despite everything he'd done. He was still my son, still the little boy who'd helped Harold and me lay the foundation for our first big project. But he'd made his choices. And now he was going to have to live with the consequences. Or die with them. Trevor, I said as everyone else dispersed, there's still a way out of this. But it requires you to tell the truth about everything. All of it. And to trust that your family will help you if you're honest with us. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw a flicker of the child he used to be. It's too late for that, Mom. I crossed too many lines, hurt too many people. Even if you could forgive me, they can't. Who can't? Trevor gestured vaguely toward the horizon, toward whatever shadows were chasing him. All of them. The people I owe money to, the employees I lied to, the family I betrayed. Some things can't be forgiven. As he walked away, heading toward his car, I wanted to call out to him. To tell him that forgiveness was possible, that families could heal, that even the worst mistakes could be overcome with enough love and effort. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I could forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The little boy who'd helped us build our dreams was gone. In his place was a man who'd stolen from us, threatened us, and endangered all of us with his reckless choices. And we still had 37 days left until Harold's deadline. 37 days for Trevor to either save himself or destroy us all trying. 2 weeks later, everything changed. I was at home paying bills when my doorbell rang at 9 o'clock at night. Through the peephole, I saw two men I didn't recognize, one tall and thin, one short and stocky, both wearing expensive suits that looked out of place in my suburban neighborhood. I didn't open the door. Mrs. Pemberton, the tall one called out, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard through the door but not enough to alert the neighbors. We need to have a conversation about your son. My blood turned to ice. These had to be the people Trevor owed money to. The dangerous people from Las Vegas who'd grown tired of waiting for their payment. I don't know what you're talking about, I called back. We know Trevor Pemberton is your son. We know he owes our employer a significant amount of money. And we know he's been having difficulty making his payments. The shorter man stepped closer to the door. Mrs. Pemberton, we're not here to hurt anyone. We just want to resolve this situation peacefully, but that requires cooperation from Trevor's family. I had my phone in my hand, ready to call 911, but something made me hesitate. These men were polite, professional even. Not what I'd expected from the kind of people who supposedly killed debtors. What do you want? I asked. 5 minutes of your time. A conversation. Nothing more. Against my better judgment, I opened the door but left the security chain attached. Through the narrow gap, I could see the men more clearly. The tall one was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and expensive glasses. The short one was younger, maybe 40s, with the kind of build that suggested he worked out religiously. Neither one looked like a killer. They looked like businessmen. Mrs. Pemberton, the tall man said, my name is Robert Chen. I'm an attorney representing certain business interests in Nevada. This is my associate, Mr. Lopez. What kind of business interests? The kind that lend money to people who can't get loans from traditional banks. Your son borrowed a substantial amount from my clients, and is having difficulty with repayment. The short man, Lopez, spoke for the first time. Mrs. Pemberton, we understand that Trevor is set to inherit a significant estate from your late husband. We're hoping to work out a payment plan that benefits everyone. I stared at them through the gap in the door, trying to process what they were saying. These weren't leg breakers or hired killers. They were lawyers and collection agents. Dangerous in their own way, but not the way Trevor had described. How much does he owe you? Chen consulted a small notebook. As of today, principal plus interest comes to $4.7 million. Nearly $5 million. Even more than Trevor had admitted to at the equipment yard. That's a lot of money for gambling debts. Lopez smiled thinly. Mr. Pemberton's debts aren't just from gambling. He's been involved in several business ventures that didn't pan out. Real estate investments, commodity trading, cryptocurrency speculation. Your son has very expensive tastes. So it wasn't just gambling. Trevor had been living a secret life of high-risk investments and financial speculation, using stolen money from the family business to fund increasingly desperate schemes. What does this have to do with me? Chen stepped closer to the door. Mrs. Pemberton, we understand there's some uncertainty about Trevor's inheritance due to conditions in your husband's will. We're hoping you might be willing to guarantee his debts, using the family business as collateral. And there it was. The real reason they'd come to my house. They wanted me to put Pemberton Construction on the line to pay Trevor's debts. Absolutely not. Perhaps you should consider the alternatives. If Trevor can't pay what he owes, there could be complications. Are you threatening me? Not at all, Chen said smoothly. We're simply pointing out that unsecured debts often have consequences that extend beyond the original debtor. Sometimes family members get drawn into situations they didn't create. Lopez nodded. It would be unfortunate if your other children found themselves dealing with their brother's financial problems. The mention of Sarah and Marcus made my anger flare. Are you threatening my children? We're expressing concern for their well-being. Large debts create large problems. Sometimes those problems affect innocent people. I closed the door and fastened the chain, then pulled out my phone and called 911. 911, what's your emergency? There are 2 men at my house making threats. They're trying to collect on debts for someone else, and they mentioned my children. By the time the police arrived 15 minutes later, Chen and Lopez were gone. But they'd left behind a business card wedged in my door frame. Chen and Associates, Debt Resolution Services, Las Vegas, Nevada. The police took a report and promised to increase patrols in my neighborhood, but there wasn't much else they could do. No laws had been broken, no direct threats had been made. Just implications and suggestions wrapped in lawyer language. But the message was clear. Trevor's problems were now family problems. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting with Sarah, Marcus, and Lisa Chen. We met at Lisa's office, which felt safer than my house or any location Trevor might know about. They came to your house? Sarah asked, her face pale. Mom, you could have been hurt. They weren't there to hurt me. They were there to recruit me. They want me to guarantee Trevor's debts using the family business as collateral. Marcus was pacing by the window. This is insane. We're talking about almost $5 million that Trevor owes to criminals. They're not criminals, Lisa said quietly. I've been researching this Chen and Associates firm since you called me. They're legitimate debt collectors who specialize in high-risk, high-interest loans. They work in a legal gray area, but they're not the mafia. That doesn't make them harmless, I said. They made it clear that if Trevor can't pay, the rest of the family might face complications. Sarah was crying again. What do we do? Do we pay them? Do we let Trevor inherit everything and hope he pays them off? We can't let Trevor inherit, I said firmly. Even if we wanted to, he can't pass the conditions in Harold's will. The forensic audit alone will destroy any chance he has. Lisa nodded. The audit findings are devastating. $3.2 million in documented theft, fake vendor accounts, forged signatures on contracts. Even if Trevor somehow produced the money to pay his debts, he'd still fail the psychological evaluation and the integrity requirements. So what's our timeline? Marcus asked. I pulled out my calendar. 23 days until Harold's 60-day deadline expires. At that point, Trevor's inheritance is forfeit and the assets transfer to us under the alternate provisions. But these debt collectors aren't going to wait 23 days, Sarah pointed out. They want their money now. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. Then we give it to them. Everyone stared at me. Mom, Marcus said carefully, we just established that we don't have $5 million. Actually, we do. I pulled out the life insurance documents Harold had left me. Harold's policy pays out $5 million. The insurance company approved the claim last week. The money is available now. Lisa frowned. Ruth, that insurance money isn't legally part of the estate. It's yours, free and clear. You could walk away from all of this, let Trevor fail the conditions, let the business go to Sarah and Marcus, and retire with $5 million. I could, I agreed. But then Trevor's creditors would go after Sarah and Marcus. They'd sue the estate, tie up the company in legal battles, make everyone's life miserable for years. Sarah was shaking her head. Mom, you can't pay Trevor's debts with your inheritance. It's not fair. Fair. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Nothing about this situation is fair. Your brother stole from the family business, lied to everyone he loved, and put us all in danger. But he's still my son. The room was quiet for a long moment. There's another factor we need to consider, Lisa said finally. If you pay off Trevor's debts, you eliminate the immediate threat to your family. But Trevor still fails the will conditions, which means the company assets still transfer to you and Sarah and Marcus. You'd own Pemberton Construction outright, worth approximately $35 million after debts. I could see the wheels turning in everyone's minds. Pay $5 million now to gain $35 million later. From a purely financial perspective, it made sense. But it wasn't about money. It was about family. I need to talk to Trevor first, I said. Before I pay his debts, before I save his life, he needs to understand what this costs us. What it costs me. That afternoon, I drove to Trevor's apartment complex for the first time in over a year. He lived in a luxury development north of the city, the kind of place with marble countertops and stainless steel appliances and rent that cost more per month than most people's mortgages. When he answered the door, I barely recognized him. He'd lost even more weight, his clothes hung loose on his frame, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Mom. His voice was hoarse with surprise. What are you doing here? We need to talk. About your debts, about the men who came to my house, about what happens next. Trevor's face went white. They came to your house? Jesus, Mom, I'm sorry. I told them you weren't involved. Apparently they disagree. I pushed past him into his apartment, and what I saw there broke my heart all over again. The place was a mess. Empty bottles everywhere, takeout containers stacked on every surface, clothes scattered across expensive furniture. But what really got to me were the photographs, pictures of our family, of Harold and me, of Trevor as a little boy helping with construction projects. In the middle of all this chaos, he'd surrounded himself with memories of the life he'd destroyed. Trevor, sit down. We need to have an honest conversation. He collapsed onto his leather couch like a man who'd given up fighting. Mom, whatever you're going to say, I deserve it. I know I screwed up. I know I hurt everyone. Do you? Do you really understand what you've done? For the next hour, I laid it all out for him. The forensic audit findings, the evidence of systematic theft, the forged documents, the fake vendor accounts. I told him about Harold's letter, about the insurance policy, about the real reason his father had structured the will with impossible conditions. Dad knew, Trevor said when I finished. It wasn't a question. He knew everything. And he still tried to save you. He created a way for you to come clean, get help, and rebuild your life. But instead of taking that opportunity, you've spent the last month trying to steal more equipment and threatening your own family. Trevor put his head in his hands. I was desperate. These people, they don't care about will readings and audit timelines. They care about getting paid. I know. That's why I'm going to pay them. His head snapped up. What? I'm going to pay your debts, Trevor. All $5 million. Harold's life insurance policy gives me enough money to make your creditors go away. Trevor stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Mom, you can't, that's your money. Your security. It's my choice. But why? After everything I've done to you, to the family, why would you save me? I looked around his destroyed apartment, at this broken man who was still my son despite everything he'd done. Because Harold was right about one thing, I'm stronger than anyone gives me credit for. Strong enough to save my family, even when they don't deserve it. Strong enough to forgive, even when forgiveness is hard. Trevor started crying then, deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be the man Dad wanted me to be. You start by accepting help. Real help. Therapy for your gambling addiction. Treatment for whatever other problems you're dealing with. You start by telling the truth about everything, not just the parts that make you look less guilty. And then what? Even if I get clean, even if I get help, I've still lost everything. The company, the inheritance, the respect of everyone I love. I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Harold's plan and what he'd really wanted to accomplish. Trevor, your father didn't structure his will to punish you. He structured it to save you. To force you to confront what you'd become and choose who you wanted to be going forward. But I can't meet the conditions. The audit, the psychological evaluation, the debt disclosure, I fail all of them. Yes, you do. Which means the company goes to me, Sarah, and Marcus. But that doesn't mean you have to be shut out forever. Trevor looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in weeks. The Trevor who stole from his family and threatened his mother can't inherit Pemberton Construction. But the Trevor who gets help, who makes amends, who proves he can be trusted again. That Trevor might have a place in the family business. Someday. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a firm commitment. But it was possibility, and for someone who'd been staring into the abyss of complete destruction, possibility was everything. Mom, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your forgiveness or your help or your money. You're right, I said simply. You don't deserve it. But love isn't about what people deserve. It's about choosing to care for someone even when they've hurt you. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 weeks ago. The woman who'd buried her husband and been blindsided by her son's betrayal. That woman had been broken, defeated, ready to accept whatever scraps she was offered. But Harold had been right. I was stronger than anyone realized. Strong enough to uncover the truth, strong enough to fight for what was mine, strong enough to save my family even when they didn't deserve saving. Tomorrow, I would pay Trevor's debts and eliminate the immediate danger to my family. In 18 days, Harold's deadline would expire and I would become the primary owner of Pemberton Construction. But tonight, for the first time since Harold's funeral, I felt like I'd won something more important than money or business assets. I'd won my family back. Damaged, complicated, and imperfect as we were still family. And families find a way to survive. The next morning, I walked into the offices of Chen & Associates in Las Vegas with a cashier's check for $5 million. The drive from Tucson had taken me 6 hours, 6 hours to think about what I was doing and why I was doing it. Robert Chen seemed genuinely surprised to see me in his downtown office. It was a legitimate-looking law firm, all mahogany and leather and expensive artwork. Nothing like the back-alley operation I'd expected. Mrs. Pemberton, he said, rising from behind his desk. This is unexpected. I hope you've had time to consider our conversation. I have. I placed the cashier's check on his desk. That's payment in full for Trevor's debts, including all interest and fees through today's date. Chen picked up the check and examined it carefully. This is generous of you. But I have to ask, does Trevor know you're doing this? He knows. And he knows what it costs us as a family. Mrs. Pemberton, paying your son's debts doesn't solve the underlying problem. Trevor has a serious gambling addiction and a pattern of high-risk financial behavior. Without treatment, he'll just accumulate new debts. I was surprised by Chen's candor. Are you trying to talk me out of giving you $5 million? Chen smiled. Mrs. Pemberton, I've been in the debt collection business for 25 years. I've seen this pattern dozens of times. Family members pay off addicts' debts, thinking they're helping, but without addressing the root cause, it just enables more destructive behavior. What would you suggest? Treatment. Real treatment. Not just a few counseling sessions, but intensive residential therapy for gambling addiction and financial impulsivity. There's a facility in Arizona that specializes in these cases. Very expensive, but very effective. Chen pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. Dr. Jennifer Martinez runs a program in Scottsdale. She's helped several of my former clients turn their lives around. I stared at the card. A debt collector was giving me advice about addiction treatment and recommending therapists. Nothing about this situation was what I'd expected. Mr. Chen, can I ask you something? When your associates came to my house, they implied that my family might face consequences if Trevor couldn't pay. Were you threatening us? Chen looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Pemberton, we were encouraging cooperation. Trevor had been avoiding our calls for weeks, and we needed to motivate him to engage with the repayment process. Sometimes family pressure is the most effective tool we have. But you weren't actually going to hurt anyone. Our firm doesn't engage in physical intimidation or violence. We're lawyers, not enforcers. But we might have pursued civil litigation against the estate, which would have tied up your family's assets for years. So Trevor's fears about being killed were largely in his own mind, fueled by gambling addiction paranoia and guilt over what he'd done. The debt collectors were aggressive, but they were businessmen, not killers. Will Trevor be safe now? From your clients, I mean. His debt is satisfied in full. He has no further obligations to our clients. But Mrs. Pemberton, he needs help. Professional help. The pattern that led him here will repeat itself if he doesn't address the underlying addiction. 2 hours later, I was back in Tucson, sitting in Dr. Martinez's office in Scottsdale with Trevor beside me. The facility looked more like a luxury resort than a treatment center. Desert landscaping, modern architecture, peaceful courtyards. Dr. Martinez was a small woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She'd reviewed Trevor's case file, Chen had apparently sent it ahead, and was asking detailed questions about his gambling history, his financial behavior, his family relationships. Trevor, she said, your mother has agreed to pay for a 6-month residential treatment program. But I need to know if you're ready to commit to the process. Treatment only works if the patient wants to change. Trevor looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. Dr. Martinez, I've lost everything that mattered to me. My father's respect, my family's trust, my future. If there's a chance to get some of that back, I'll do whatever it takes. Recovery isn't about getting things back, Dr. Martinez said gently. It's about becoming someone new. The person you were before, the person who stole from his family and lied to everyone he loved, that person needs to go away forever. Trevor nodded. I understand. I hope you do. Because the program we're discussing isn't just about gambling addiction. We're going to address the underlying personality disorders that enabled your behavior. The entitlement, the manipulation, the willingness to hurt people you love for personal gain. That's deep psychological work. After the consultation, Trevor was admitted immediately. The facility preferred not to give addicts time to change their minds or use again before starting treatment. As I hugged him goodbye in the lobby, he whispered in my ear, Mom, why are you doing this for me? After everything I've done, why are you giving me another chance? I thought about Harold's letter, about the life insurance policy, about the 40 years we'd spent building something together. Because your father loved you enough to plan for your redemption, even when you were stealing from him. And because I'm strong enough to finish what he started. Driving home alone through the desert sunset, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because Trevor's problems were solved, they were just beginning, but because I'd made a choice based on love instead of anger. Harold's 60-day deadline was now just 12 days away. The forensic audit was complete, documenting every penny Trevor had stolen. The psychological evaluation was obviously impossible since Trevor was in residential treatment. And the debt disclosure had revealed gambling and investment losses far beyond what anyone had imagined. Trevor would fail every condition in Harold's will. Which meant in 12 days, I would become the primary owner of Pemberton Construction. But that evening, as I sat in Harold's study reading his letter one more time, I realized something important. Harold's plan wasn't really about punishing Trevor or rewarding me. It was about protecting the family business and giving everyone a chance to become who they were meant to be. Trevor was getting that chance now, in Dr. Martinez's treatment facility. Sarah and Marcus would get their chance when they inherited their shares of the company. And I was getting my chance to prove that I was more than just Harold's widow. I was a businesswoman in my own right, capable of running a $40 million company. The next morning, I drove to Pemberton Construction and called a meeting with all the employees. Word had gotten out about Trevor's problems and the uncertain future of the company. People were worried about their jobs, their benefits, their families. I stood in the main warehouse, surrounded by 40 years' worth of equipment and memories, and looked at the faces of people who'd helped Harold and me build something extraordinary. I know you're all concerned about what's going to happen to the company, I said. I know there have been rumors and speculation about Trevor's situation and my husband's will. Pete Sandoval stepped forward. Mrs. Pemberton, we just want to know if we're going to have jobs next month. You are. In 12 days, when the conditions of Harold's will are finalized, I will become the majority owner of Pemberton Construction. And my first priority is protecting the jobs and livelihoods of every person in this room. There was a murmur of relief from the crowd. But I also want you to know that things are going to change. We're going to rebuild this company's culture around the values that Harold and I started with: integrity, quality, family. We're going to be completely transparent about our finances and operations. And we're going to make sure that what happened with Trevor never happens again. An older employee named Maria raised her hand. What about Trevor? Is he coming back? I thought about my son, beginning the long process of rebuilding himself in Dr. Martinez's facility. Trevor is getting the help he needs to address his problems. Whether he has a future with this company depends on whether he can prove that he's learned from his mistakes and become someone worthy of your trust again. After the meeting, Pete came up to me privately. Mrs. Pemberton, can I ask you something? Are you sure you're ready for this? Running a construction company is a tough business, especially for a woman. I smiled. Pete, who do you think was doing the books and managing contracts while Harold was out charming clients and making deals? Who do you think kept this place running during his heart attacks and hospital stays? Pete grinned. Yes, I guess you've been ready for this longer than any of us realized. That night, I called Sarah and Marcus to update them on everything that had happened. Trevor's treatment, the debt payment, my plans for the company. Mom, Sarah said, are you sure about taking on this much responsibility? You could sell the company and retire comfortably with the insurance money. I could. But your father didn't build Pemberton Construction so it could be sold to strangers. He built it to be a family legacy, something we could all be proud of. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Mom, what if Trevor gets better? What if the treatment works and he becomes someone we can trust again? Do you think Dad would have wanted him to have another chance? It was the question I'd been asking myself for days. I think your father wanted all of his children to have the chance to be their best selves. Trevor's getting that chance now. If he takes it, if he proves he's changed, then we'll deal with that when the time comes. 12 days. 12 days until Harold's plan reached its conclusion and I officially inherited the company we'd built together. But I was beginning to understand that the inheritance was just the beginning. The real work, rebuilding trust, healing relationships, creating something better than what we'd lost, that work would take years. And for the first time since Harold's death, I was excited about the challenge. With 5 days left until Harold's deadline, everything started falling apart in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was in my office at Pemberton Construction. I'd moved into Harold's space to manage the transition, when Lisa Chen called with devastating news. Ruth, we have a problem. A big problem. What now? I've been going through the final audit papers, and I found something we missed. Trevor didn't just steal money from company accounts. He used Pemberton Construction as collateral for some of his investment schemes. My blood turned cold. What does that mean? It means there are liens against company assets that we didn't know about. Equipment, property, even the building you're sitting in. If these investments don't pay off, and most of them won't, the creditors can seize company assets to satisfy Trevor's debts. I sank into Harold's chair, feeling like the ground was shifting under my feet again. How much are we talking about? Best case scenario? About $8 million in potential claims against company assets. Worst case? They could take everything. Everything. After paying off Trevor's gambling debts, after getting him into treatment, after believing we'd solved the immediate crisis, we were facing an even bigger threat. Lisa, how did we miss this? Because Trevor was very clever about how he structured these deals. He used shell companies and complex financial instruments to hide the true nature of the agreements. I only found them because I was doing a deep dive into some questionable business licenses. I spent the rest of the day poring over the documents Lisa had discovered. Trevor had been even busier than we'd realized. While stealing money from company accounts, he'd also been pledging company assets as security for high-risk investments in everything from cryptocurrency to real estate development in Dubai. The scope of his betrayal was staggering. That evening, I drove to the treatment facility in Scottsdale. Dr. Martinez met me in her office, looking concerned. Mrs. Pemberton, Trevor is making good progress in treatment, but is still in a very fragile state. Any major stress or confrontation could set back his recovery significantly. I understand. But I need information only he can provide, and it can't wait. Dr. Martinez led me to a quiet conference room where Trevor was waiting. He looked better than he had a week ago, cleaner, more alert, less desperate, but still fragile. When he saw my expression, his face fell. "What's wrong now?" I showed him the documents Lisa had found. As he read through them, I watched his face cycle through surprise, recognition, and finally resignation. "You pledged company assets as collateral for investment schemes," I said. "Assets that don't belong to you." Trevor set the papers down and rubbed his face with his hands. "Mom, I can explain." "Explain what?" "That you weren't content just stealing money, you had to risk the entire company on your gambling schemes." "They weren't gambling schemes. They were legitimate investments that would have paid off huge returns. The cryptocurrency fund alone was projected to return 400% in 18 months. Projected by who? The same people who took your money. Dr. Martinez interrupted gently. "Ruth, I understand you're upset, but I need you to keep your voice down. Other patients can hear you." I took a deep breath and tried to control my anger. "Trevor, these liens could destroy the company. Even if I inherit everything when the deadline expires, the creditors could still seize assets to satisfy your debts." Trevor looked confused. "But you paid off the Vegas debts." Chen said I was clear. "These are different debts. Investment partnerships, development deals, cryptocurrency funds. Completely separate from your gambling obligations." For the first time since entering treatment, Trevor looked truly panicked. "How much?" "Potentially $8 million. Maybe more." Trevor went white. That's impossible. Most of those deals were supposed to be low risk. Conservative investments. Conservative investments don't require construction company buildings as collateral, Trevor. Dr. Martinez was taking notes, clearly documenting this conversation for Trevor's treatment file. "Trevor, we talked about this in group therapy. The pattern of minimizing consequences and rationalizing destructive behavior. Do you see how you're doing it right now?" Trevor was quiet for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" I pulled out a legal pad. "Everything. Every investment, every partnership, every deal you made using company assets. Names, dates, amounts, contract terms. All of it." For the next 2 hours, Trevor walked me through a maze of financial schemes that would have impressed a Wall Street trader. Real estate developments in 3 states, cryptocurrency mining operations, foreign currency speculation, even a partnership in a medical marijuana cultivation facility in Colorado. "Trevor," I said when he finished, "some of these investments might actually be legitimate. If they pay off, we could recover some of the money." That's what I was hoping. That's why I kept expanding into new opportunities. I thought if just one of them hit big, I could pay everything back and no one would ever know. Dr. Martinez shook her head. "Trevor, that's classic addiction thinking. Using bigger risks to solve problems created by previous risks. It never works." As I drove back to Tucson that night, I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we were facing. Even if I inherited the company in 5 days, I might not be able to keep it. Trevor's investment schemes could destroy everything Harold and I had built. But then I remembered something Harold used to say, "Every problem is just information you haven't organized yet." The next morning, I called an emergency meeting with Lisa Chen and a business attorney named David Walsh who specialized in complex commercial disputes. We spread Trevor's investment documents across the conference table like pieces of a puzzle. "The good news," David said after reviewing everything, "is that several of these investments were structured illegally. Trevor didn't have authority to pledge company assets without board approval, which means the contracts might be voidable." "What's the bad news?" "The bad news is that challenging these contracts will take time and money. Even if we win, the legal fees could bankrupt the company before we see any recovery." Lisa was studying Trevor's timeline of investments. "There's something else. Look at these dates. Most of these deals were made in the 3 months before Harold's death. It's almost like Trevor knew he was running out of time." A chill ran down my spine. "Are you suggesting Trevor knew Harold was going to die?" "I'm suggesting Trevor might have known Harold was sick before Harold told the family. Maybe he saw medical records, maybe he overheard phone calls. But the timing is suspicious. The possibility that Trevor had accelerated his theft because he knew Harold was dying made his betrayal even worse. But it also gave us leverage. If we can prove Trevor knew about Harold's condition and used that information to make these deals, it would constitute fraud," David said. Fraud makes contracts voidable regardless of other considerations. We spent the next 3 days building a case. Phone records showing calls between Trevor and Harold's doctor. Medical appointments Trevor had attended but never mentioned to the family. Investment contracts signed just days after Harold's most serious cardiac episode. The pattern was clear. Trevor had known his father was dying and had used that knowledge to accelerate his theft and speculation, knowing he might not have another chance. On the morning of Harold's 60-day deadline, I woke up early and drove to the cemetery where Harold was buried. The sun was just coming up over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I sat beside Harold's grave and told him everything that had happened. About Trevor's additional schemes, about the treatment facility, about the legal battles we were facing. "I know this isn't how you planned it," I said to the headstone. "But I'm going to save what we built together. However long it takes, whatever it costs, I'm going to make sure Trevor's mistakes don't destroy 40 years of work." At exactly 10 o'clock that morning, I walked into James Richardson's law office for the final meeting. Trevor was still in treatment, unable to attend. Sarah and Marcus were there, along with Lisa Chen and David Walsh. Mr. Richardson looked tired, like the past 2 months had aged him years. "Well," he said, settling behind his desk, "today marks 60 days since Harold's death and the reading of his will. Trevor Michael Pemberton has failed to meet any of the conditions specified for his inheritance." He opened a new file and pulled out a document I'd never seen before. "Therefore, according to the terms of Harold's will, Trevor's inheritance is forfeit. All assets originally bequeathed to him are now distributed as follows: 50% to Ruth Ann Pemberton, 25% to Sarah Elizabeth Pemberton Walsh, and 25% to Marcus David Pemberton." I was now the majority owner of Pemberton Construction. But even as Mr. Richardson handed me the ownership documents, I knew the real battle was just beginning. Trevor's investment schemes still threatened everything we'd inherited. The legal challenges could take years to resolve. "Congratulations, Mrs. Pemberton," Mr. Richardson said. "You now own one of the most successful construction companies in Arizona. And one of the most complicated legal messes in Arizona," I thought. But Harold had been right about one thing. I was stronger than anyone realized. Strong enough to spend $5 million saving my son. Strong enough to inherit a company worth $40 million. And strong enough to fight for years if necessary to protect what we'd built together. As we left the law office, Sarah took my arm. "Mom, are you ready for this?" I looked at my daughter, at Marcus walking beside us, at the city Harold and I had helped build spread out in the desert sunshine. "Sweetheart, I've been ready for this my whole life. I just never knew it." 6 months later, I stood in the main conference room at Pemberton Construction, looking at the most diverse board of directors the company had ever had. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her nursing job to learn the business side of construction. Marcus had surprised everyone by showing a real talent for project design and client relations. Pete Sandoval had been promoted to Vice President of Operations. And Lisa Chen had joined us as Chief Financial Officer. The legal battles over Trevor's investment schemes were ongoing, but we were winning. David Walsh had successfully voided most of the fraudulent contracts, and we'd actually recovered about $2 million from investments that had paid off better than expected. The company was not just surviving, it was thriving. But the real test came on a Tuesday morning in March when Dr. Martinez called me. "Ruth, Trevor has successfully completed the residential portion of his treatment program. He's ready to transition to outpatient care, but he needs a support system and, eventually, meaningful work." I'd been dreading this call and anticipating it in equal measure. How is he? Different. Genuinely different. The Trevor who's been in treatment for the past 6 months isn't the same man who stole from your company and threatened your family. But change is fragile, especially in early recovery. He'll need ongoing support and accountability. That afternoon, I drove to the treatment facility to see Trevor one last time before his discharge. The man waiting for me in Dr. Martinez's office was almost unrecognizable from the desperate, angry person I'd confronted 8 months ago. Trevor had gained back some healthy weight, his eyes were clear, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity I hadn't seen in years. But more than his physical appearance, something fundamental had changed in his demeanor. The entitled arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like humility. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, Trevor." We sat in awkward silence for a moment, two people who'd shared a lifetime but were essentially strangers now. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. Not just for the money or the lies or the threats, but for becoming someone you couldn't recognize as your son. Trevor. Please let me finish. I need to say this. He took a deep breath. I spent so many years blaming Dad for not giving me enough responsibility, blaming you for not understanding the business, blaming Sarah and Marcus for not caring about the company. But the truth is, I was angry at myself for not being the man Dad raised me to be. I could see tears forming in his eyes. The gambling, the stealing, the lying, it was all about trying to prove I was smarter than everyone else, trying to show that I could build something bigger than what you and Dad created. But all I did was tear down what took you 40 years to build. What do you want now, Trevor? I want to earn back your trust. Not all at once, I know that's impossible. But gradually, over time, through consistent actions that prove I've changed. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. Ruth, part of Trevor's recovery plan involves making amends to the people he harmed. But true amends aren't just apologies, they're changed behavior over extended periods. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity. But what I saw was something I hadn't seen in years, genuine remorse and a willingness to accept consequences. Trevor, what did you have in mind? I want to work for the company again. Not in management, not in a position of trust or authority. I want to start at the bottom and prove myself one day at a time. The idea of Trevor working for Pemberton Construction again should have made me angry. After everything he'd done, the suggestion that he could just come back and work his way up should have seemed ridiculous. But Harold's words from his letter echoed in my mind. Love isn't about what people deserve. It's about choosing to care for someone even when they've hurt you. If, and I emphasize if, you were to work for the company again, it would be under very specific conditions. Trevor nodded eagerly. Whatever you think is appropriate. I pulled out a notebook where I'd been writing down thoughts about this possibility for weeks. First, you'd start as a general laborer. The same job you had when you were 16 and working summers. Same pay, same responsibilities. No special treatment because you're my son. I understand. Second, you'd be subject to random drug and alcohol testing, financial auditing, and psychological evaluation. Any sign of relapse or dishonesty, and you're gone permanently. That's fair. Third, you'd work directly under Pete Sandoval's supervision. He'd evaluate your performance and decide if and when you're ready for additional responsibilities. Not me, not Sarah, not Marcus. Pete. Trevor smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Pete's a good man. If anyone can keep me honest, it's him. And fourth, I said, looking directly into his eyes, you'd sign a legal agreement acknowledging that you have no ownership interest in Pemberton Construction and no expectation of future inheritance. If you ever work your way up to management again, it would be as an employee, not as family. This condition was the hardest one, and I could see Trevor struggling with it. For a moment, I thought he might argue or try to negotiate. Instead, he nodded slowly. Mom, I gave up my right to inherit anything when I stole from the family. I understand that. If I ever earn back a place in the company, it will be because I've proven I deserve it, not because of my last name. Dr. Martinez was taking notes throughout our conversation. Ruth, I think this is exactly the kind of structured accountability that will support Trevor's continued recovery. Clear expectations, consistent consequences, and opportunities to rebuild trust gradually. After Trevor was discharged, he moved into a small apartment near the construction yard and began working as a general laborer on Pete's crew. I watched from my office window as my son, a man with an MBA who'd once run multi-million-dollar projects, mixed concrete and carried supplies for minimum wage. But more importantly, I watched Pete and the other workers slowly begin to trust him again. Not because of who he used to be, but because of who he was proving himself to be now. The first few months were difficult. Trevor was clearly struggling with the physical demands of manual labor and the emotional challenge of working alongside employees who remembered him as the boss.